Welcome to the medieval jousting tourney, where you'll see feverish blacksmiths, fearless knights, and maybe just a teeny tiny skosh of blood. Sure, there's a chance of death, but bear in mind that when it comes to jousting, the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. Oh, also, they're bears, which is a convenient segue since this video is all about the baroreceptor reflex. The baroreceptor reflex is a fast neural negative feedback mechanism responsible for the minute to minute regulation of arterial blood pressure. This is why our bearsmith here is rapidly forging away with a reflex hammer. Baroreceptors are most responsive to changes in arterial pressure, so rapid changes produce the strongest response. Quick side note, the more long term regulation of blood pressure is carried out by the renin angiotensin aldosterone system, which we will cover in more detail in another sketch. In order to quickly respond to changes in blood pressure, the solitary nucleus in the medulla integrates info from the baroreceptors regarding any changes above or below the brain's set point for the mean arterial pressure, around 100 millimeters of mercury. The medulla's cardiovascular centers then act accordingly by increasing or decreasing sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow to the heart and blood vessels. Kind of like how this metal cauldron integrates multiple flows of molten metal into a single outflow. There are two types of baroreceptors that you need to be aware of. The first of these are the carotid sinus baroreceptors, which are stretch receptors in the vessel walls of the carotid sinus. These sit just above the bifurcation of the common carotid arteries, which bear a striking resemblance to this large pipe in the forge. Carotid sinus baroreceptors respond to both increases and decreases in arterial pressure by increasing or decreasing their firing rate, respectively. This information is carried to the medulla by the glossopharyngeal nerve, or cranial nerve 9, which is why there is a 9-shaped gauge with up and down arrows on our carotid-like pipe. The other type are the aortic arch baroreceptors, which are stretch receptors in the vessel walls of, you guessed it, the aortic arch. Unlike baroreceptors in the carotid sinus, those in the aortic arch respond only to increases in arterial pressure. This information is carried to the medulla by the afferent limb of the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10. This is why the gauge on this arched pipe has a normal up arrow, but an X'd out down arrow. In addition to carrying information to the medulla, the vagus nerve also has an efferent limb that carries the parasympathetic outflow to the heart. Now that you understand the bare necessities, sorry, I had to, let's walk through what exactly happens when there is a sudden change in blood pressure. First, let's detail how the baroreceptor reflex would respond to a drop in blood pressure, like the one this poor bear bleeding out on the ground is experiencing. I'm sure it is but a scratch. As the pressure drops, there will be less stretch in the walls of the carotid sinus, which leads to a decrease in the firing rate of the carotid sinus branch of cranial nerve 9. You can remember this with the bear trumpeter and the rather limp-looking notes squeaking out from his 9-shaped trumpet. That song's just not firing like it's supposed to. This decrease in firing rate is interpreted by the cardiovascular centers in the solitary nucleus of the medulla, which respond by decreasing the parasympathetic or vagal outflow to the heart and increasing the sympathetic outflow to the heart and blood vessels. This is why our returning symbol for parasympathetic, this unfortunate parakeet, has been crushed under his knight's bulk, while our symbol for sympathetic, this consolation sympathy medal, is being held up in case he survives. On second thought, maybe it is a bit more than a scratch. These changes in outflow will produce various effects that act to increase cardiac output and arterial blood pressure. The increase in sympathetic and decrease in parasympathetic outflow to the SA node leads to an increase in heart rate, which explains why this rather disappointed jester is holding up a heart clock. Additionally, the increase in sympathetic outflow to the rest of the heart increases cardiac contractility, so his jester is calling for a medic by aggressively squeezing an air horn. Based on that expression, I'm guessing he bet on the wrong horse, and bear in the joust. The increase in sympathetic outflow also results in arteriolar and venous vasoconstriction, which is reflected in the jester's uncomfortably tight red and blue pants. Arteriolar vasoconstriction leads to an increase in the total peripheral resistance and arterial pressure, while venous vasoconstriction leads to an increase in venous return and a corresponding increase in cardiac output via the Frank-Starling mechanism, as well as an increase in arterial pressure. So that's how the baroreceptor reflex responds when arterial pressure decreases. Now let's take a look at what happens when arterial pressure increases. When there's a sudden rise in arterial pressure, such as that experienced by this amped up, victorious jouster, the baroreceptor reflex triggers the exact opposite actions of those that occur when blood pressure drops. Man, I've heard of sore winners, but even the horse looks a little too pleased with himself. In this situation, an increase in pressure, and therefore stretch, will be detected by baroreceptors in both the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. Because of this, both the firing rate of the carotid sinus branch of cranial nerve 9 and the afferent limb of cranial nerve 10 will increase. This is why, unlike his rapidly fading opponent, our winner's hornist has X-shaped straps on his chest and is firing out lively, rising notes from his 9-shaped horn. The cardiovascular centers in the medulla respond by directing an increase in parasympathetic outflow to the heart, hence this raised, very much alive parakeet. Simultaneously, sympathetic outflow to the heart and blood vessels decreases, which is depicted by this fallen sympathy metal crushed into the dirt. These changes in outflow produce various effects that act to decrease cardiac output and arterial blood pressure. The increase in parasympathetic and decrease in sympathetic outflow to the SA node leads to a decrease in heart rate, while the decrease in sympathetic tone to the heart leads to a decrease in contractility and stroke volume. These effects are depicted here by this discarded broken heart clock and floppy air horn, respectively. Additionally, the decrease in sympathetic outflow to the blood vessels leads to arteriolar and venous vasodilation, hence this avid fan's floppy red sleeves and blue pant legs. Arteriolar vasodilation leads to a decrease in total peripheral resistance and arterial pressure, while venous vasodilation leads to a decrease in venous return and a corresponding decrease in cardiac output via the Frank-Starling mechanism, as well as an increase in arterial pressure. Now that you understand the steps of the baroreceptor reflex, let's move on to two techniques that can be used to test the baroreceptor reflex, and sometimes exploit it in an attempt to terminate supraventricular tachycardia, SVT, the Valsalva maneuver and carotid sinus massage. The Valsalva maneuver is performed by expiring against a closed glottis, such as during coughing, heavy lifting, or defecation, and is why this bear is acting as the forge bellows. At least that's what I think he's doing. Expiring against a closed glottis increases intrathoracic pressure, leading to a decrease in venous return and a corresponding decrease in cardiac output and arterial pressure. The carotid sinus baroreceptors respond to this drop in pressure the exact same way as before. Reduced stretch leads to a decrease in firing of cranial nerve 9, which increases sympathetic outflow and decreases parasympathetic outflow, resulting in an increase in heart rate. When the Valsalva maneuver is stopped, there is a rebound increase in venous return, followed by a corresponding increase in cardiac output and arterial pressure. The carotid sinus and aortic arch baroreceptors respond to this increase in pressure the same way we covered previously. More stretch leads to an increase in firing of cranial nerves 9 and 10, which decreases sympathetic outflow and increases parasympathetic outflow, resulting in a decrease in heart rate. This is the part of the maneuver that may help terminate SVT. The other technique, carotid sinus massage, is performed by gently massaging the area of the neck where the carotid pulse is felt. See where our bellowing bear is pressing. This pressure activates the carotid sinus baroreceptors, mimicking the second phase of Valsalva and producing a decrease in heart rate that can terminate SVT. All right, before we settle in for the next event, let's take a few moments to review what we've learned. The baroreceptor reflex is a fast, neural negative feedback mechanism responsible for the minute-to-minute regulation of arterial blood pressure. The solitary nucleus in the medulla integrates info from baroreceptors regarding changes in blood pressure and responds by adjusting sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow to the heart and blood vessels. Carotid sinus baroreceptors respond to both increases and decreases in blood pressure and relay info to the medulla via the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9. Aortic arch baroreceptors respond only to increases in blood pressure and relay info to the medulla via the afferent limb of the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. When there is a drop in blood pressure, the firing rate of cranial nerve 9 decreases. The cardiovascular centers in the medulla respond by decreasing parasympathetic and increasing sympathetic outflow. These changes in outflow act to increase arterial pressure by increasing the heart rate and contractility, as well as stimulating arteriolar and venous vasoconstriction. When there is a sudden increase in blood pressure, the firing rate of both cranial nerves 9 and 10 increases. The cardiovascular centers in the medulla respond by increasing parasympathetic and decreasing sympathetic outflow. These changes in outflow act to decrease arterial pressure by decreasing the heart rate and contractility, as well as stimulating arteriolar and venous vasodilation. The Valsalva maneuver and carotid sinus massage are techniques that can be employed to test the baroreceptor reflex and exploit it in an attempt to terminate SVT. And that does it for the baroreceptor reflex. And just in time, too. Sounds like the next round of betting is about to start. I'm wagering all my denarii on Sir Smugs-a-lot. Mostly because he's the only contender not exsanguinated. See you in the next one.